Hello everyone and welcome back to my salon. Today's hair-raising topic was inspired by Misty from CSCLB, who sent in the question that I will do my very best to answer in this video, which is, what is language? Some historical context, linguists for centuries have pondered over this exact same question and have come up with nothing. Seriously, no two linguists have been able to agree upon a single definition, so currently we don't have a concrete way of defining what a language is. So I took it upon myself to study neurolinguistics, psycholinguistics, and the design features of a language in order to form my own definition, which is as follows. Language is a systematic form of communication that can only function when all cognitive operations related to linguistics are intact. What? Let's break this down. So I mentioned that language is a systematic form of communication. So does this mean that all methods of communication are languages? To answer this question, I'm going to bring up my favorite linguist, Charles Hockett's findings. Charles Hockett was able to design a list that identified the descriptive characters of a language in order to differentiate them from modes of communication. So, short answer, no, not all modes of communication are languages. Let's look at animals. In order for a method of communication to be considered a language, they need to have all of these design features. So with Hockett's design features, animals do not have a language because they are unable to communicate about things that aren't present before the speaker, and because their communication systems are fixed, meaning that they don't have the design features of displacement and productivity. Therefore, they only have a mode of communication, not a language. Now that that's clarified, we're going to head into my salon in order to explain what I mean when I say that language can only function when all cognitive operations related to linguistics are intact.
I wanted to give a quick review of the brain while I was prepping my model. Our brain is divided into two hemispheres, each of which are responsible for processing certain kinds of information. These hemispheres are then divided into 4 lobes, all of which contribute to the recognition, production, and perception of language.
Now, it's important to note that the hemispheres and lobes are generally important areas for all cognitive functions. However, there are specific regions in the brain that are specifically attributed to language. This includes the inferior frontal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, the sylvian parietal temporal area, and the middle and inferior temporal gyrus, all of which are very important for language. Now that we covered the basics of neurolinguistics, let's take a look at specific processes that help us to produce and comprehend language in the first place.
We're now going to look at the psycholinguistics portion of this video. And so in order to produce a spoken word, we're going to need the help of the inferior frontal gyrus, the middle and inferior temporal gyrus, as well as the motor cortex. The hairstyle I am making right now is going to be representative of these 4 sections. And here I've added labels just to make it a little easier for you guys to see visually. To produce a spoken word, the medial and inferior temporal gyrus is activated to assess the lexicon. Then the information travels to the inferior frontal gyrus, where the information is interpreted, and then from here the information is transported into the motor cortex to direct our muscles for articulation to produce a word.
How about when we hear a word? How are we able to understand it? The process is very different. For instance,
the parts of the brain that we utilize to comprehend a verbal language are the auditory cortex, the extreme capsule, and the medial and inferior temporal gyrus. While this hairstyle strongly resembles the previous one, there are various differences that are important for us to be able to comprehend language. It's important to note that connections between the brain and the body are contralateral, meaning that anything heard from the right ear will get processed on the left side of the brain and vice versa. The auditory cortex processes information perceived by the ears, then transports the semantic information to the extreme capsule, where the auditory stimulus is interpreted in the medial and inferior temporal gyrus and matches information to a lexical entry in our brain. Here is the finished piece.
So, why is this all important? Why are we even getting into the biology of the brain to explain what language is? Let me show you what happens when one of these brain parts malfunctions and how it affects our abilities to communicate.
So here I'm going to take my scissors and completely chop off the inferior frontal gyrus.
I'm just kidding. If we were to cut off that much hair, my model will probably end up looking like... Not that I'm one to judge people's choice of hairstyles, but I think we can all agree that those looks are a little bit outdated. So instead, I'm just going to mess up the inferior frontal gyrus portion of the hairstyle and show you guys what I mean.
The more thread that I cut off, the more connections in the brain I sever. Because the inferior frontal gyrus is completely messed up, the connections in the motor cortex are severed. Since the medial and inferior temporal gyrus is still intact, we still have a good lexicon in our brain, but we can no longer produce words properly.
Damage to the inferior frontal gyrus can lead to the diagnosis of the disorder Broca's aphasia, in which the comprehension of a language still remains intact in our brains, but in terms of speech, it gets a little rocky. Let me show you.
Here is an audio of a neuroscientist asking someone diagnosed with Broca's aphasia to speak.
Perfect. Now tell me your name. George, cause I've had.
As you can hear from the video, the man grew very frustrated because he was unable to tell the scientist what his name was, so in the end he just asked for his iPad to be able to write down his name, meaning that he does have the lexicon in his head, he does know what his name is, he's able to write it down, he just cannot produce it verbally. Therefore, it is essential that we consider how important these cognitive systems are in our brain to producing and comprehending language, or else no one would have a comprehensible mode of communication and there would just be no language in the first place. So to reiterate the point that I made at the very beginning of this video, language is a systematic form of communication that can only function when all cognitive operations related to linguistics are intact. I hope I was able to answer your question, Miss C, as to what is a language by having a strong focus in biology and by touching upon the design features of a language. Thank you and see you all next time.